Well, hey, Chris.
Hey, Chance. That
How's it
was
going?
a smooth and natural introduction, wasn't it?
Absolutely. So I think I don't want to speak for Chris, but I think that we're both pretty excited about this. Is this the first original show that we've done for Mascot?
I believe it is. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
super excited about it.
So welcome to Other People's Movies. As you might guess from the title, Chris and I are going to talk about some other people's movies, and in this case, the movie is one of, I think it's safe to say, the modern classics, Night of the Living Dead, or maybe it's not even a modern classic, maybe it's just one of the great films of all time.
Yeah, I think there are certain, and obviously you and I both like horror movies a lot, but I feel like even outside of the realm of horror, because we hang around in that ghetto a lot, it's even, I think, even for people who aren't necessarily horror aficionados, this is a film that is well known as a sort of a paradigm shift in film in the late 60s, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and it's, of course, I don't know. It was recently, as we're recording this, it was recently Mary. I'm really bad with Mary. Is it Mary Shelley Wolfencraft's?
Mary Wollstonecraft.
Wollstonecraft. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
Wolfencraft is a whole different kind of monster. I think it's safe to say that she, with Frankenstein, kind of invented. Did she invent science fiction? Is that where we're going?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there have been disputes, but usually it's from dudes who don't want a lady to have invented it. So, yeah.
Well, and I'd
think
be
so.
curious what their argument was, who had done it before that. But anyways, occasionally you have a work that comes along that, like Frankenstein, that creates like an entire genre. And though George Romero did not invent the horror movie, it's safe to say that he invented the modern zombie movie. So it's just so rare that a movie like that comes along that really redefines a whole subgenre or invents, in this case, a whole subgenre like that.
Yeah, and I think probably as we talk, we'll probably mention a couple of things that were helpful in making that a reality. Obviously, some of the filmmaking aspects, the fact that the movie unfortunately went directly into the public domain almost upon release.
Well, unfortunate for the filmmakers, but fortunate for for all of
For
us.
the listeners of other people's movies.
Yeah, yeah, and for that matter, I mean, and I wonder if we should get into that now because we just saw the title card a few seconds ago without that copyright notice, which was the way that copyright works now is a lot simpler and a lot less onerous on the creator than it was back in the '60s. But because the movie, I think it's fair to say as good as this movie is and as influential as it would be regardless, the fact that it went immediately into the public domain and was a staple of late night TV and VHS and home video for so many years, certainly didn't hurt its reputation.
Oh, for sure. And I think it could also be argued that I don't know if the zombie subgenre would be as prolific as it is if they hadn't invented a monster that couldn't have been copyrighted and therefore could be copied.
Wow! Whoa! Yeah. What would have happened? I'd never even thought about that because obviously, I can make a Frankenstein movie, but I can't make a movie that uses like Universal's famous Boris Karloff style Frankenstein. So
Right.
yeah, what if the ghouls in this movie were actually under copyright and no low budget filmmaker could just go and throw some grease paint, on one of their friends and call them a ghoul or a zombie or
Right,
whatever.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think a good analogy would be like, well, what if the Babadook came out today and was public domain? There would probably be 1,000 Babadook movies suddenly,
Wow, yeah. So there's an alternate universe where the modern zombie subgenre never caught on because they never changed the name of this movie from, was it Night of the Flesh Eaters? That was the original title card? Yeah. And then the copyright notice would have been intact. It's considering how onerous and difficult copyright used to be, it's really amazing. There's this movie, we've talked about that movie, Charade, which is a great movie. It's funny how many of these older movies slipped into the public domain just because of a clerical error, for lack of a better word,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I actually just want to point this out before we forget because we'd already got past the credits. But
Sure.
I think it's interesting. We know all the names for all of this film fairly well. I mean, obviously, we know Romero the best, but we know John Russo and Russell Streiner. I think the thing that's really fascinating to me is so many people, so many movies are well-known, horror films are well-known for their score. And even though this is a super well-known film, nobody ever talks about the score, and that's because it was a stock score. Like they didn't pay a single composer. It was just a lot of stock music that they had access to from, I guess, from their day job as like documentarians.
Yeah, yeah, which is, and now that you say that, I haven't paid attention to the music in this movie in a long time, but I don't remember it ever feeling canned. It feels, it seems like whatever they found feels cool and appropriate for the material.
Oh, for sure. And and I imagine, Romero had, 5 jobs on this: director, writer, cinematographer, editor. So I would imagine, in all likelihood, he was at least one of the key people deciding the music here.
Yeah, yeah. And which is funny, another famous or maybe infamous public domain movie, Plan 9 from Outer Space, I know that movie also relied on stock library scores at the time, which is funny because and I have a soft spot for science fiction and horror theme music from the 50s. It's so melodramatic and bombastic. But the music, say what you will about Plan 9 from Outer Space, the music is fantastic. You couldn't ask for better, big bombastic 50s sci-fi horror music. So the stock libraries that were around in the 50s and the 60s must have been pretty impressive as far as the quality of the stuff in the catalogs.
Definitely, yeah. I think it's interesting too that a moment ago we were talking during the scene where he said they're coming to get you, Barbara, which is like one of the iconic lines of the film, is
Right.
used in a lot of the advertising, and I think it's hilarious because it's just him doing an impression of Boris Karloff, which when you think about it, was like, can you imagine if your movie got famous and the most famous line in it was someone doing an impression of a person from a different movie?
Well, that does bring up a fun anecdote. My first feature film as a director, and I guess as a director, I worked on some other stuff. But the first movie that I wrote and I co-directed with my good friend Chuck Hartzell is a zombie movie that is very much indebted to Night of the Living Dead. We basically did what if Night of the Living Dead happened in rural Alabama and was really silly, when I wrote that script, it had been a while since I'd watched Night of the Living Dead, and for whatever reason the movie was just, nothing about the movie was fresh on my mind, and when you're in the middle of making a low budget independent movie, it's easy to kind of get wrapped up in your own little world. So anyways, when the movie came out, one of the lead characters in the movie is named Barbara, and of course everybody immediately assumed that it was an homage to Night of the Living Dead, when in actuality it was a complete coincidence, and I had forgotten they're coming to get you, Barbara. That's how wrapped up I was in trying to get that movie made. I had completely blanked on the point that one of the most famous lines of this movie mentioned Barbara, and I had named a character Barbara, completely, completely accidentally. So.
Well, that's how I know you're an honorable man, because most of the rest of us would just take the victory lap if someone thought that we had put in a lot of effort and cleverness in doing something. Yeah. I know there have been times when I've taken credit for it.
Yeah, well, and there are several, and not that we're talking about my movie, but in that movie there are several homages to different things that I've loved. But honestly, we just felt like we didn't want to play too hard on Night of the Living Dead, because it is such a giant. I mean, it's the giant in the fields, another thing that I think is really interesting about this movie is we often talk about how it was ground zero for what we call the modern zombie movie. I guess there were a lot of zombie movies back in the day, but those were more, I guess it's safe to say, like Haitian voodoo zombies, more of the traditional, I guess. And Night of the Living Dead is more of a science fiction horror story, whereas traditional zombie stories were more fantastical. Is that fair?
Right. I think well, whether it's witchcraft, voodoo, sometimes it's induced by drugs. There's always some. It's always more of a I guess you could say a metaphysical explanation than a scientific one.
Right. And so and I don't think Romero was ever shy about admitting that one of his big inspirations for this movie was actually not a traditional zombie movie or anything or book, but it was I Am Legend, the Richard Matheson book. Which happens to be one of my favorites. I guess it's kind of a novella technically. It's a short book, but it happens to be one of my favorites of all time. It's a really great book. It's been adapted directly at least 3 times. There was Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price, Omega Man with Charlton Heston, and then they did a Will Smith movie called I Am Legend just a few years ago. But I find it so fascinating that Romero invented what we consider the modern zombie movie by taking by borrowing liberally from a vampire book. And that being said, Matheson's vampire book, and I'm not an expert on vampire on the history of vampire literature, but Matheson's vampire book was less fantastical and less mythological and more scientific, you know. So, but that's just one of my favorite things about this movie and the legacy of this movie is that it was inspired largely from vampires, and famously, nobody ever says zombies in Night of the Living Dead. They call them ghouls, or I guess they usually call them ghouls, you know. But I would be curious when fans started calling the creatures in this movie zombies, because it didn't come from Romero himself, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to imagine it probably came from any of the subsequent, I don't want to say rip-off movies, but films inspired by the popularity of this film. I think that's certainly true. And I like what you said about the influence of vampirism on the creation of these, because I feel like there's actually a lot of connective tissue between the modern zombie and the vampire anyway. In fact, the one major difference really is their level of cognition that they have, because they are creatures that have died and come back to life. They are creatures that feed on humans. They have, there's the element of the bite. And so like they do have a lot of connective tissue in common. And interestingly, one of the things I think I've always been fascinated with about zombies, I mean, I guess to a degree it's true of werewolves and vampires too, but in some ways, zombies are sort of the perfect entity in that they procreate by doing the exact same thing that they would do to feed. The one act actually serves as both procreation, meaning they're creating another zombie, and they're also feeding at the same time. So I think there's something fascinating about the idea of that's such a daunting enemy.
Yeah, wow, yeah, because as animals, basically, we have procreation. Oh, that's a great shot. Procreation, and at some point we're going to have to actually talk specifically about this movie as opposed to the movie's legacy, which in fairness, it's a huge legacy. But yeah, for humans to have, or animals in general to have 2 jobs where procreation and food, are separate. For the zombies to have that 2 in 1, I've never thought about the efficiency of that.
Yeah, it's almost really insurmountable.
Great. Now that being said, that brings up another aspect of modern zombie lore that kind of happened accidentally. Did you know that according to Romero, he had never thought that the zombie bites in this movie literally were what spread the virus? Basically, in his mind, if you got bit by a zombie, you would die and then you would be resurrected as a zombie. However, if you just got hit by a car and died, you would still be resurrected as a zombie, because whatever's happening in this world is basically making all of the dead, rise until their heads are decapitated or whatever.
Right. Well, and I think The Walking Dead actually sort of copped to doing that in season 2 or 3, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And that actually, we a lot of times we'll think that the zombie bite, goes back to Romero, but it just didn't go back to this particular movie. It probably went to some other, guy who had ripped this movie off, and and
Yeah, for sure.
and misinterpreted what Romero was doing. So again, like I said, I know that we haven't been talking about the actual movie that much, but it just casts an incredibly long shadow. I mean, there's like this, there's like Star Wars. You know, it might be, it's got to be in the top 10 influential movies of all time. I mean, it's just such a juggernaut.
Yeah, well, I also think that it's interesting in that it's one of the most influential horror films to have come as late as it did, because all the other ones, I would say Frankenstein, The Wolfman, The Mummy, and Dracula, all came out in 31, 32 from Universal over a very short time, mostly because horror films weren't being made. They were incredibly influential. But the really fascinating thing about this movie is there was another 35 years of movies before this came out, and I would argue this is equally as influential as the Universal films.
Yeah, and absolutely, and from a and as far as a movie's influence on, you know, filmmakers in 2019, I would argue that this, as much as, I mean, I think that the Universal monsters and those, especially those original, you know, 4 or 5 movies, are kind of universally beloved, but I don't know if they're as directly influential on modern filmmakers as Night of the Living Dead. Obviously, they're influential, but just watching this movie, the shot composition, you know, the cinematography, the way it moves, it feels really modern. You know, if some kid, you know, if some kid made a movie like this, well. Obviously, now that this movie exists, stylistically though, if you made a movie about this that was not about zombies, it was about, you know, whatever else, you know, it was about mummies.
Right.
I think it would still. I think with the kind of pseudo documentary camera style and the way the edits work, I think it would still feel really modern. You know.
Definitely. Well, and also just the subject matter and the dynamic of the conflict between the characters is such that it not only allegorically, but in some cases literally is representing stuff that society is still sort of struggling with.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I mean, and we might should actually save some of that for the end, because also the ending of this movie, one of the all-time great downer endings. It's just so perfect when it finally rolls around. But yeah, there's definitely the internal conflicts. Well, it's really smart from from an independent production standpoint, because you know you're kind of keeping things limited to drama unfolding inside a confined space, as opposed to them going out and shooting on 300 different locations or whatever. You know, there was actually I don't know if it was a local adaptation or if they got the script from somewhere else, but some friends of mine in town that do theater stuff actually did Night of the Living Dead as a stage play.
Yeah, and I mean, there's really not much that had to be adjusted. I would
Yeah,
imagine.
it works really well. They basically it was a really clever production. They had like their main stage, their main like house set, as it were. And then occasionally that would go dark, and they would play some video clips of things that were happening outside. So they basically pre-recorded some stuff for the exteriors, and they would cut to that on occasion. But most of it was just the drama unfolding inside the house, you know. And it's just, it's like a bottle episode of your favorite TV show. It really allows for, you know, you let the actors work out, and it's just a good setup for drama.
Well, speaking of the actors, this might be a good time to sort of talk about, because we saw Russ Striner. He left us a little early. He was the brother in the opening, but we've got Judith O'Dea here playing Barbara, and we've got Dwayne Jones playing Ben, and then obviously we should maybe make mention Bill Heinzman was the very first zombie that you see, literally the very first zombie ever, essentially this kind of zombie.
I didn't even know I didn't even know that guy's name. That's quite a claim to fame, though.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean it's literally the you know, the typical sort of shambling, take orders from your zombie master. That was the perceived image of the zombie, literally up until Bill Heinzman shuffled onto screen and grabbed at Judith O'Dea there. So that literally was a very first time. So it's kind of fun. I mean, you know, I don't know what Bill Heinzman went on to do after this, but that's a pretty fantastic claim to fame to be able to have.
Absolutely. I feel like in Fight Club, his name was Bill Heinzman. We should put that on T-shirts.
Exactly. That's fantastic. Yeah, another thing, because there's such a small crew and cast that they had, so many of the people that were behind the camera ended up having in front of the camera roles as well. Russell Streiner, who played the brother, actually is one of the producers on the film. And Carl Hardman, who we haven't met him yet, but he plays Harry, he was also a producer. And then much later in the film, George Romero and John Russo have cameos as reporters during some of the television broadcasts.
Yeah.
So everybody was doing double, triple, quadruple duty on this movie.
Well, that makes me feel pretty good when Chuck and I and Stacy started our little company, Cruelest Productions. The first movie we made, it was literally Cruelest, where basically if you weren't acting, you were shooting, and if you weren't shooting, you were acting. You know, so it's glad that we're not the only people who had to take that method.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's very sort of like, this is very sort of a commune vibe, you know, they were all young, probably very liberal, hippie group, you know, making this movie, and everybody was just throwing in, doing whatever they had to do, you know. It's funny, if you look through the credits, you'll see a lot of last names that are connected to a lot of other last names, so it seems like a lot of family members were getting favors called in on them.
I have been there myself, yeah. You know, and it's a little bit of a tangent, but it's one of the lingering questions that I kind of have about this movie. And I'm a cinematography nerd. I love cameras, and I love lights, and I love shooting, and I love looking at compositions and that sort of thing. To me, one of the interesting things about this movie that I don't know if I've ever heard explained, you know, they shot it in black and white, which is very evocative of classic horror films. But I've got to imagine that a lot of the reasoning behind that was that black and white film stock is about half the price of color film stock. So a lot of independent movies in the 60s and 70s, I say the 70s, it was less prevalent in the 70s, but in the 60s there were a lot of independent movies that were still shooting in black and white. But the aspect ratio has always fascinated me, because, you know, widescreen had pretty much taken over cinemas by probably even the early 60s. You know, if you watch the horror and the science fiction movies of the late 50s, stuff like This Island Earth, and even some of the later Universal movies, those movies were shot in what they call an open matte. So basically, you leave a lot of headroom in the image, so that if it is projected on a wider screen, you can chop off the bottom and the top of the screen and make it quote unquote widescreen. Even though we still see a lot of those movies framed for the classic Academy ratio, which is 4:3, 1:3 to 1. But this movie, you know, I've never seen it shown widescreen, and even this shot right here, I mean, the framing is really tight. This is a really tight, like 4:3 aspect ratio. You know, they didn't shoot this thinking that somebody might be going to mat it for widescreen. And I wonder if it was. Have you ever heard any detailed explanation or detailed discussion of the framing composite or the framing choices that they made for this?
I haven't heard anything about that. I do wonder, however, if it has something to do with the fact of where they came from, the arena of filmmaking they were doing before this, which is they were working a lot in industrial film and documentary in the Pittsburgh area.
Right.
So they were not necessarily versed in what was going up onto big screens. They were shooting stuff that was going to be used for, I guess you would say, internal use only for a lot of places. You know.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It was. Maybe does that make a difference?
That would, and a lot of that stuff would be shot in 16 millimeter, and 16 millimeter was traditionally, especially at that time, 16 millimeter was traditionally the 4:3 aspect ratio like this. You know. Usually, well, we could turn this into a really boring discussion of me explaining the way that films are projected.
Yes, please.
But the short answer is that the short answer is that 35 millimeter films were, and we've all watched, you know, Citizen Kane and you know, The Third Man. 35 millimeter films were the actual exposed frame is the shape of this movie that we're watching right here. It's like I said, it's basically a little bit wider than it is tall, but it's almost a square. When widescreen first came into play, when the movie theaters were trying to find a way to compete with television, one of the things that they did was they said, okay, well, let's just, you know, since TVs are a fixed shape, let's make our screens wider. And there was an expensive way to do that, which meant that you used special lenses that squeezed the picture in, and that's a really long, boring, technical explanation. But the cheap way to do it was that you just basically chopped off the top and the bottom of the picture and blew up the frame. So you lost a little bit of resolution, but we're talking about 35 millimeter film here, which is very sharp to begin with. But it made the picture, seem to be wider. So the camera that they were using at this time, a 35 millimeter camera, wouldn't really affect whether or not they could have shot widescreen. It's really more of a shooting widescreen on 35 millimeter in the 60s was more of a decision of just protecting for widescreen than it was actually making some adjustment to the equipment or something like that. So, but yeah, that's I wish that Romero was still with us. It's rare that I can think of, when you go to like a comic convention or whatever, and people are lined up to ask William Shatner a question or whatever, it's rare that I can think of anything interesting to ask that the poor guy hasn't been asked 1,000 times already. But
right,
being that I've never heard anybody talk about the framing choices they made, it'd be great if Romero was still around to ask him. So how did you guys come up with that? Was it just what you were used to, or were you going for? To me, by modern standards, a frame like this tends to feel a little claustrophobic because we're so used to wider screens. When you kind of bring the sides in like that, you're kind of forcing everything to be give everything a little less room to breathe, for lack of a better explanation. So stylistically it works. It's just a matter. I'm just really curious as to whether it was. Whether it was strictly a stylistic choice or if it was if it came down to something else, but anyways, I'll try to. That's probably enough talking about why this frame is shaped the way it's shaped.
Yeah. Well, the only thing I'll say is I once heard Martin Scorsese say he loves widescreen, but it's still impossible to shoot a good close-up in widescreen, and so much of this movie is about claustrophobia and staying close to things that it's possible. He recognized that if he was trying to shoot in widescreen, that it was going to rob you a little bit of the ability to stay in so close, because you can't frame someone in the center of a widescreen shot, or you've just got dead space on either side of them.
Yeah, either that or you do like in The Good and the Bad and the Ugly, and you go like it's all eyes, basically their eyes, fill up
right.
the whole screen. So, but that's also that's not really at that point that says something different than just showing somebody's eyes and nose and mouth. That's a different thing.
Right. Exactly.
But anyways.
Well, I think, and this is, obviously this has been sussed over hundreds of times, and Romero even himself weighed in on it, the idea of the casting of Dwayne Jones in the lead role. For many years, people said that this was, a super progressive movie because they cast a black lead, and George Romero was the first one to say, well, I didn't cast him because he was black, I cast him because he was the best actor. And I think some people took that to mean that it wasn't a progressive decision, and I think in some ways, it's entirely the opposite. Only a person as progressive as George Romero could have looked at a room full of people, saw that the black guy was doing the best, and then didn't have any other considerations other than that. In the 60s, can you imagine like a studio head deciding that they were just going to make the lead black and have no other conversations about whether or not that was going to be okay?
Yeah, it's and I feel like that. That since Romero's not with us anymore, we probably maybe we over mythologize.
Right.
We might we might defer to his genius and his kind soul too much. But honestly, man, I mean, I've never heard of anybody who met him at a convention. I've never heard an interview with him. I've never heard anything that he's written or talked about that made me think that he was anything other than an amazingly kind soul,
Mm-hmm.
and really, like you're so right. What it says about someone who in the late '60s, good gosh, was progressive enough. I can't think of another word for it, or was empathetic enough, or had enough to say, well, this is the best actor. We just put him in the lead. I mean, that's a revolutionary casting decision. and,
Right.
and I guess it would have maybe been a little bit more revolutionary if Romero had said, well, you know, I really feel like that for this story to say what it needs to say socially, we need to have, you know, a black man in the lead, and this guy's not quite the best actor, but he's very good, and this is going to make a statement. But there's just something so wonderful about him making a statement by not making a statement. That seems so Romero in a way, if that makes any sense.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've always said as a filmmaker, it's important to me to have diversity in film because it's not there. But the thing I like about Romero is that it feels like his head was maybe in a space where it was never a consideration that it couldn't be anybody.
Right. Yeah, he was kind of there's a joke that's not funny where it's not really a joke. People for a brief naive minute thought that after America had a black president that we were post-racial, you know. And that's a really lovely thought, but obviously we've learned in recent years it's definitely not the case. But Romero really was, you know. I mean, he had moved past that and was able to do what he thought was right for the project. And again, ended up accidentally, you know, making a lot more social statements than I think he probably realized.
Yeah, I think sometimes the best messages are the ones that are so ingrained in you that you're not even aware that you're putting them there.
Yeah. Well, tell you what, I think this is we're having to put the one of our lead actresses to bed here, so this is probably a good place to take a brief moment and cut to commercial, and we'll be right back with more other people's movies and more of George Romero's classic Night of the Living Dead.